please.
Panel member Jay Corzine, first of all, you said you'd be willing to talk to us about one of your more surprising findings, which was handguns more lethal than rifles. Hit it.
Data set. I think that, well, handguns are not very accurate over much of a distance, to be honest about it. You hit somebody at 100 yards, it's an accident. It's not good shooting. I think probably what's happening here, although the data doesn't exist, is that you actually can shoot somebody with a rifle successfully with an average level of skill at a much greater distance than you can with a handgun. So I think that probably what's happening here is a significant, and the difference isn't great, but a more significant percentage of the rifle wounds are those that occur at some distance. Generally speaking, most handgun shootings are up close and personal. So that's my best guess as to it right now.
So the rifle rounds are likelier to hit in peripheral, less fatal, less lethal areas of the body?
I think with increasing distance, probably.
Yeah.
Obviously, also shotguns are not very effective at much of a distance, but once again, if the person's in the same room with you, the shotgun is a really pretty lethal instrument.
Is it possible to just control for distance and compare handguns with rifles that say under 20 feet or something?
I don't think there's no data on it. What I looked at in NIBRA's data was the idea of you looking at rifles versus handguns only for those cases that also involved a robbery, because you can't rob somebody at much of a distance. They can't hear you.
Right.
On the other hand, there were so few cases of rifles being used in a shooting that were linked to a robbery incident in NIBRAS that it wasn't feasible to do it.
Right.
So that was a problem. So it's one of those interesting questions, and we're just kind of stuck on it.
You mentioned the problem of getting death data, gun homicides, for example, for counties and small towns and so on. I should comment that over 90% of counties you can't get that due to the CDC rule that they won't allow aggregate counts to be released if they're under 10.
Right. For those jurisdictions that report to NIBRAS, you can use NIBRAS data to break it down to agencies.
Yeah, you got to use a different source of information.
And then aggregate agency data to the county level. You're right about the CDC limitations on homicide.
And that's not an alternative available for suicide or gun accidents. And
it is not.
CDC claims that they're just interpreting congressional intent and they cite a particular law, but there's nothing in that law that mandated any such thing. They're just making it very difficult to get a hold of a larger number of counties and cities for any sub-state level analysis.
I would agree.
Yeah. Would the panel agree that there's no earthly reason for them to be doing that restriction? I mean, their claim is that somehow knowing an aggregate count reveals individual information about people. I can't even figure out what their reasoning is behind that.
Well, again, I'm not agreeing with their reasoning, but their reasoning, I guess, is that if you knew that there were two in this given county, you could go to other sources of information and get the name and then link the data.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like a good balance of cost to benefit. I agree.
It sounds like you talked to the same people I did. I got that same story,
Yeah,
and they
right.
said, well, you could look, if it was one or two, you could look it up, in the newspapers for homicides. And I said, well, if it was in the newspapers, how am I getting information from this aggregate count? I mean, and she had no response to that. It was just, well, that's the rules. So anyway, question for David Hemenway. Let's see. By the way, I completely agree with you that investigator-initiated projects are the way to go. I only wish that's the way CDC thought, but I'm not running CDC, so just wanted to endorse that idea. You're absolutely right. Big question about case control studies. I'm not so convinced that CDC is not interested in suicide. I haven't heard anything to that effect. And I know certainly many of us are going to urge good case control studies. Unfortunately, past research has often just used conveniently available data sets that were never designed for that particular purpose of gun effects on suicide. So apparently a lot of the, the findings are sensitive to which control variables or confounding variables are controlled. What would you recommend in the way of improving research on selecting, measuring, and controlling for confounding variables?
There's always the problem about worrying about controls. People have tried various different things, but you really have to try to do the best you can to make sure the cases and controls are as much alike as you can get them. I don't have any, I don't do lots of case control studies myself. I don't have any profound insights that you should probably ask an epidemiologist who is doing lots of case control studies rather than me.
All right. Another question about the concept of hostile gun displays. You were also interpreting those as aggressive uses of guns, and in a sense, of course, that's perfectly reasonable. It's sort of a tautology. Aggressive and hostile kind of mean the same thing. But if you got somebody in a survey sample who had done something criminal and then the victim pulled a gun on them, surely that gun use was hostile. If that's not hostile, I don't know what is. I mean, anybody who uses a gun defensively is plenty hostile towards their opponent. Wouldn't survey respondents describe those as hostile gun displays?
We always, again, ask them to describe the situation. And so they can lie about the situation. I mean, they're still just survey respondents, but all the ones, the hostile gun displays, if there was anything that looked like it from their description, again, all these things are just one sides of hostile interactions. We threw it out, but basically there were very, very few like that. The ones we really ended up throwing out was when someone said it was a hostile gun display, but when they told the story, it did not look like it was really directed against them. So it'd be, we were at a party, there were 30 of us there, and this guy came in, and there was a fight, and he took his gun and he sort of waved it around, and we thought that's not a hostile gun display probably against you. It's maybe against somebody else, but you were just there, and so we threw that out. But throwing those out, you still got large numbers relative to, say, self-defense gun use.
By the way, I also endorse the idea of getting responses to open-ended questions. What happened? Tell your story. Allow people to just tell the story as a story, which is their inclination to do anyway, on top of asking all the systematic questions about details that you need to get.
Yeah, we were surprised because we asked maybe 40 or so questions, and then just reading the answers to those, I had in my mind some situation, and then when you read it's like, my goodness, this is not at all what I pictured.
Did you ever ask any people for permission to tape record them?
I don't think so. No, this was all written down by
I think that'd be a great idea.
Professional
tape record them
surveyors.
and make transcripts publicly available, and people could reanalyze the transcripts or listen to the audio recordings for that matter. Just post them if people were willing to also give permission to make them publicly available. Not everybody would, but some would. So, that's all I had to say.
Let me start with Jay. You raised the issue of the massive shootings, and they clearly have been important. We don't have very much information on what undoubtedly has happened in a variety of places where there were intended mass shootings that were aborted in one way or another. Have you seen, and I've just seen newspaper reports of those events, but I would think there would be a reasonable number of those. And can we infer anything, and do you know anything about anyone, if not yourself, has collected those data? And do we know anything about what happened in those, and can those provide a lesson for aborting future intended mass shootings?
Very possibly. The Newark Police Department in 2010 put together a data set on, I think they call it mass shootings. There's no criteria in terms of the number of victims, but they also include information on prevented shootings. Most of the prevented shootings were in the school context. In fact, there are more school shootings prevented listed in their data set than school shootings that
Who
actually
put this
occurred.
together? New York
New
Police
York Police
Department?
Department. It's available online. It's called Active Shooter. If you just Google Active Shooter, you should be able to pull up the report. It's let's see, your folks got it together. It's
Yeah,
Active Shooter.
Active Shooter. It's called Active Shooter, and they just put they update it every year. They just put the last version.
Yeah. But in most cases, other students in the school either were
Learned about it.
concerned about something that the student said, or they saw something that they had put on the social media and then reported it to school authorities. And also, they did use a criteria for including events as shootings prevented. They only included those events when the police investigated, the student had made some active preparations for carrying out what they were talking about. They had the materials, for example, to make homemade bombs at their house. There were about 30 to 35 of them in this data set, but almost all of them involve other students bringing what they consider to be a real problem with this particular other student to the attention of the appropriate authorities. I don't know of any collection of materials for prevented shootings other than that. The one place where you might find it would be prevented workplace shootings. That would be another area, but there's one or two of those listed in the active shooter file, but there's not much.
Do you know of anyone that has looked at the actual mass shootings that in retrospect they found afterwards that there were other people who shared it? And would there be opportunities would have been opportunities to share that and thereby abort that one?
The Secret Service report in, I think it was 2002 or 2003, found that approximately 60-65% of the school shootings in their data file were known by other students.
Were known by other students who could have reported it.
Who could have reported it, yes. Actually, schools are probably the single location best equipped to prevent mass shootings because by definition, the prospective shooter has substantial contacts on a regular basis with a wide number of other people and vice versa. The other thing that I think is probably very helpful in schools is most of the students are actively involved on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as everybody around the table knows, people are incredibly dumb about what they put on Facebook. I don't know if
or what they tell to their colleagues that could have. I'm impressed at that 65% of active occurred mass shootings that were, in retrospect, known to have been known by other students.
If I may be, I haven't read that report for a while, but I think it's about 2/3, about 65%.
Could I pick up on what this gentleman said? Because I think that's important, and I guess my mic is on. Last year, there was a pretty significant book, you may be familiar with it, a book called Rampage, I believe, and it was a book that was based on a congressional study. It was a congressionally funded study. And that's exactly what they did. They went at the mandate of Congress. They went and looked at all of the mass shootings over the last 15 years and looked to see if they could distill out corollaries, commonalities of those shootings. And the findings were interesting. I have a position paper I'd be glad to share with you to listen, but they're all by young men. They were in rural areas. These people had slow buildup. They just don't snap. This is a long buildup over rage over a long period of time. told many about
When
it.
you say rural, do you mean rural and suburban?
Rural and suburban, not inner city. And it's
Yes.
contrasted with inner city. They don't act out in school. They have no criminal record. They're of above average intelligence. They attacked the institution. They were not attacking a person. They were attacking just anyone who showed up in front of the gun. They were mentally ill. They were suffering from a diagnosable mental illness, which is over a long period of time. And another statistic that you hear a lot about is very interesting, is that only 4% of the mentally ill are violent. Well, that may be true, but almost 100% of the mass shooters were mentally ill.
Thank you, Jim. I want to return back to the committee on this. Thank you. Al, other questions?
Yeah, I think it was you, Jay, who talked about gun thefts. We've heard a lot about gun thefts here. To what extent are the gun thefts truly victim events? Somebody took my gun and I'm a victim, as opposed to people who disposed of the gun one way or another. And do we know? I was struck by, I think someone said we had between 300,000 and 500,000 gun thefts in a year. How much of that was true theft and how much of that was reported because the gun was sold or disposed of otherwise that they didn't want to be held responsible for?
I don't think there's any way to know the answer.
It's
Well, you
out
might-
of the NCVS.
Yeah, but there's also CJ data. You might want to go for consistency. I just don't know. The same question arises for motor vehicle theft. There's a number of people who, in essence, pay somebody to take their vehicle, take it out into a rural area, and torch it because they've discovered, I've got a $2,200 repair bill coming up, and that vehicle is only worth $2,600. And in order to basically get the reimbursement from your insurance company, you do have to report it to the police. And I think probably anybody who did that for a motor vehicle, if they showed up in the NCVS survey, for consistency's sake, would probably report it. I'm not sure about that. There's no data.
It's a confidential report. Nobody can kind of cross-check it with insurance or whatever. But in any case,
But, yeah,
that 300,000 to 500,000 estimate that's being kicked around that you've heard, that's an NCVS estimate.
So that's a scale up from the number of actual reports.
Well, the
in
number reported
NCVS.
to the cops has got to be minuscule by comparison. The FBI had sort of half-assed statistics on it, and they're just a tiny, tiny fraction. I mean, nobody takes those numbers seriously. It's not even 10%.
Do I hear a testable research question forming here? Perhaps.
This is for Shelley Greenberg. You had a fascinating array of distributions of different kinds of events and factors in them. Were you able to put numbers on those distributions? What fraction of them are occurred that way?
No. No, that wasn't the,
It was purely a brainstorming list rather than an attempt to generate the actual numbers associated with each of those events.
right, the question was to police officers about what they do, what they see, and how they report back. Not to get total. We could go back and do that as a research effort.
There's one for David. You highlighted many of the problems in the defensive gun use issue. And you have developed a sequence of more and more sophisticated surveys and more sophisticated analyses of knowing what to interpret, what to throw out because it was different. Are we at a point where we could really do a strong survey of defensive gun use in a very disinterested way to really try to find out how much of that goes on in what form and to try to categorize various kinds of defensive gun use. It strikes me that there have been enough efforts. Gary has done his things, and other people have used the NCVS, which is sort of a minimal inquiry. You've done fairly sophisticated inquiries, but inevitably of a smaller sample that one might like. Are we at a point where we can pursue that issue and get a much better understanding of how much defensive gun use goes on?
I think we could probably get a little more sophisticated understanding. I don't know if we could get a lot more. It really, two of the many issues. One is response rate. It's hard to get. It's been getting harder and harder to get a true representative sample of the United States. Secondly, it may or may be more difficult to get accurate. Well, the problem is not, the refusal rate is very low typically. What the problem is, the response rate is that as there's more call blocking, when you call somebody up, they're immediately in the denominator. And once the phone rings, you got them in your denominator, and if they never answer the phone, your response rate is much lower than you'd hope. No, but a lot of them know what the number is, and it's not a number they want to respond to.
But Al, there is an alternative where that problem is way lower, and probably the people under 30 here are familiar with the internet surveys, and people used to object to them because they're biased by social class, because poor people don't have computers and so on. But they now do sampling via mail, and everybody has a resident. 99% of the population have a residence, and then they're recruited into panels that are representative of the U.S. population, and they agree to do a certain number of surveys every month, and in exchange they get free computers, free internet access, and so on, and they have samples that are like spot on in comparison to Census Bureau figures, astoundingly similar to the population figures we're familiar with. And then you have, virtually no refusal rate because they're sort of contractually obliged to participate in a certain minimum number of surveys. They don't have to participate in all of them, but it's like, it's a 67% cooperation rate. Yeah, I mean, with a lot of advanced capital who could afford to do that, and it's true, but they match up real well so far on those things you can measure. And no, you can't measure, how many defensive gun users should they have gotten in the sample, but on those things you can measure, they match up real well.
Do you consider it feasible to do, in what ways would it be doable to really get a better, fuller, richer measure?
Since it's been so long since it's been done, I think it would be really nice to be able to do. There's no question. I think I think it'd be great also to survey criminals, to get them to see if they can discuss
A number of criminologists
Yeah.
convene panels of criminals and do that. And Jan, I was impressed by your downward trend in those accidental gun deaths.
I love that question. Thank you.
What are your hypotheses of what contributed to that?
So I think there are an awful lot of hypotheses that people toss around, but they're just that.
Lay out some of those.
Oh, sure, they were in the slide, but they include things like changes in medical examiner habits about coding, that maybe 30 years ago, the very same kind of circumstances that would have been coded as an accident, the medical examiner now codes as either undetermined or as homicide. There are people who talk about maybe storage practices in the home have changed. Maybe the number of people who are going hunting for recreation has changed because a fair number of these accidents are hunting accidents. Maybe the mix of guns in the home has changed.
But we should be able to examine those subsets
I agree.
10 years ago or 20 years ago compared to today to see which of those subsets has changed
Oh, I think
dramatically.
I think it's an eminently answerable question, or at the very least, we could get much, much closer to an answer than we have now. So I think that's almost low-hanging fruit, to be honest.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of times today, we've heard people talk about National Violent Death Reporting System. And currently with 18 states, of course, expanding it to 50 states. But there's also been a couple of times people have said that you should expand the nature of the data that go in, not just expand the coverage of the system. And I was wondering, Jan, you made some reference to that, and could you add to that? And other panelists, if you have things you would like to add as well.
Sure. So I certainly don't want to denigrate NVDRS. I think it's very valuable, and expanding it would be helpful. There are some kinds of questions, though, since this is a panel about circumstances, that NVDRS, it's my understanding, can't really answer. So my examples had to do with the circumstances of suicide. So NVDRS might get us an awful lot more information presently about the type of gun, for example. But it may not be able to tell us when was the gun purchased and who was the owner of the gun. Things that aren't typically either in the police report of a suicide, because the police don't tend to investigate suicides very deeply once it becomes clear it's a suicide, or in the medical examiner's report. Things that you would have to do supplemental sort of data acquisition for, like, again, survey research of the next of kin of suicide victims, or tracing. You'd have to commit yourself to tracing the guns of suicide victims, for example, to try to or some subset of them, to try to get a sense for, again, how proximate the gun purchase or ownership was to the suicide. So those are some examples of how you might choose to go deeper in NVDRS.
I had one other question for Jay I forgot to ask.
I'm going to let David follow up on, because he had something he wanted to
Yeah,
add on.
in terms of the NVDRS, I mean, being an injury researcher, what I'd really like to see happen is for it to be expanded to poisonings. Because some of the suicides and poisonings, it's not clear how well they're classified as suicides or unintentional. And also simply because what's happened in the injury world is that the most interesting and horrible thing is that unintentional poisonings have just skyrocketed, so that in large numbers, of states in the United States, the leading cause of injury death is not firearms, it's not suicide, it's not motor vehicles, but it's unintentional poisonings, and that's something we know very, very little about. And so that's what I think in terms of the injury world, not in terms of the gun world, but in terms of the injury world, that's where we really should go next, and it's going to be much cheaper than doing what Jan suggests.
That's another place where small cell sizes in whiskers and wonder that won't spit out the answer to how many poisoning deaths there are in a given county or sometimes even state over a given period of time has been a hindrance to research that some of my students have worked on.
And Shelley?
I think we need to do more also to look at the work being done in trauma medicine, compare the number of suicides today versus 20 years ago, resulting in death, being saved by modern trauma medicine. It affects a lot in the whole area of violent death. And a lot of the discussion, we leave out the advances in trauma medicine.
Yeah, I think that's right. Another hypothesis for explaining at least part of the reduction in the accidental firearm-related deaths.
I don't have anything on this.
Gary, please.
Yeah, I hear that all the time, and I keep asking medical people for some evidence that the ability to treat successfully gunshot wounds has improved, and there were enormous improvements up through the early 60s, and I asked them, well, give me a study that shows since the early 60s higher survival rates. And I think what happened is eventually medicine got so good, everybody survives once you reach professional medical care. So it was a ceiling effect. There was no room for further improvement.
Yeah,
So
although it may be less about the skill of the individual doc that you get to, but whether you get to a level 1 trauma center or not, how close you were to a level 1 trauma center when
yeah,
the injury occurred. There's good evidence recently published that level 1 trauma, that survival controlling for other factors in level 1 trauma facilities is greater. So.
but is the trend nationally since this trend has been occurring, is that's what's going on? Is there a huge increase in?
There's definitely
Yeah,
been an increase in the number and scope of catchment area of level 1 trauma facilities. Absolutely.
So they are getting more available.
Yeah, I think that is right. Now, how much of that trend that explains
Right,
is,
sure,
again, we don't know.
sure. Anyway, the question I had about Jay was, you were mentioning the national incident-based reporting system, and understanding that it only covers maybe 1/6 of the country or whatever. Within
About a
that,
quarter now.
okay, within that portion of the country that is covered, I was interested in the data on gun possession at the time of arrest as a measure of how available are guns among criminals. It's critical to know whether interventions are succeeding in getting guns away from that particular subset of the population. And so my question is, within those 25% of the states or whatever, what's your sense of how complete the data are, or what's the general quality of the data? Could it be used for this purpose?
It's something we haven't looked at in depth. We actually went to NIBRS looking for an alternative to the SHR on mass killings, so that we have a data set on all mass killings in the SHR for 2001 through 10. It's 298 cases. Not surprisingly, the comparable data from NIBRS is 87 cases. Once we get a couple of other things completed, we're going to start looking at this question in more detail. It is completed in a high percentage of cases, and it also does allow for 2 firearms to be recorded. So in some cases, you will find, 2 handguns, but then in other cases, you'll find a shotgun and a handgun, or a rifle and a shotgun, et cetera. So it may be of enough quality for those states where there's complete coverage. And there's now 11 states with complete coverage, including some that have major urban areas in them, such as Michigan and Tennessee. Colorado is very close to complete coverage. Most of the early states that developed complete coverage in NIBRS were predominantly rural states like Iowa. So there's a real possibility that data might be used for actually looking at a legal change in Tennessee, for example, over time, and seeing if it makes a difference in the types of firearms that criminals seem to have access to after the intervention went into effect. So it has some real possibilities. I would like to go back and comment on the last question. In some cities, and I think Baltimore is one of them, there's sort of been a street culture response to improvements in trauma center care. And if you're going to get shot, Baltimore is a great place to get shot, because you've got Johns Hopkins, you've got Maryland Shock Trauma, one of the best medical communities in the country. But I know the Baltimore Police Department has kept data for, I think, about 15 years on the percentage of shootings that involve shootings in the head. And they consistently show an upward trend. And the consensus, I've talked to police officers there, and I think they're absolutely right, that especially if the shooting's involved with disputes between drug organizations, you don't want the person coming back for payback after they get out of the hospital. And if you have the opportunity, the way that you ensure that they won't do that is to make sure you get at least 1 shot into the head. And in trauma care, the 2 types of firearm wounds that are most likely to produce a fatality, one is a headshot and the other one is simply shotguns.
I had a question for David. You laid out a very provocative idea to find out if guns preserve or threaten democracy. Is there a way you could turn that into a testable research question?
What I would like to see is to get a number of historians to try to look at lots of different countries around the world where you have had democracies for a long time, and to see to the extent that guns really matter one way or the other. I don't know if it's how testable, what else I'd sort of like to see is sort of the notion of, so one of the things that the gun lobby is really worried about is registration because they don't want to know who has guns. But it seems to me that with the internet enough, if you were, if federal government, you wanted to know 90% of who had guns, you could just, I mean, I think the advertisers know everything you do. I don't see why the federal government couldn't know that better than a registry would provide. But that would be of interest to me too, this notion. But I just like to sort of see historically what, but I have this is not my area.
Good. Gary or Al, do you have any additional questions? You don't have? Okay. Then I think I'll wrap us up with, we've been focusing a lot on content, but I was curious for the entire panel, are there certain methodologies that you think we should emphasize to CDC in building this research agenda, of ones that we should try and move towards, others that we should move away from? Just a general kind of scientific sense of that.
Alphabetical order?
It's been a long day. For any studies that are done at the aggregate level, whether it's counties or census tracts or whatever, I think there needs to be attention to spatial autocorrelation and use of the regression-based techniques through the GEOTA program that comes out of Arizona State. I'd also say that there's probably, in terms of some prospective proposals that may be funded, more of an emphasis on using geographical information systems for mapping purposes may well be helpful in many cases.
Could I just ask you to elaborate further? In your suggestion about time series, it strikes me that the ideal arrangement would be when there's a change in statute or a change in something, and to see the before and after effect, the interrupted time series phenomenon. Is that what you had in mind?
No, I think that's likely to be part of any type of time series study that CDC would fund. There's a contagion effect across areas. So that, for example, in research that's done on urban census tracts, traditionally the idea was, well, the homicide rate in a particular tract is primarily related to factors that are found internal to that tract. But increasingly in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a recognition that just as you get a contagion effect in terms of disease models, there's often a contagion effect in terms of homicide in urban areas, so that the homicide in particular tracts are affected not only by conditions in that tract, but also to some extent by homicides in surrounding tracts or conditions in surrounding tracts. And we now have ways to model that impact that didn't exist, 20 years ago. And to give you an example, there's a number of studies at the county level. Actually, David Borgia years ago did a couple of studies on Illinois counties using the FOID data. I think you were a co-author on one of those, weren't you? I remember. Good memory. Proud of myself. And a lot of these studies now would be better suited if, in fact, there was a measure for special autocorrelation included in the basic research models to see if, in fact, there is a geographical contagion. Most of the studies that have looked at geographical contagion for homicide, but not all, have found that, yes, it does exist. And sometimes it significantly changes what's happening with other variables in the model, sometimes no. The basic program that people are using is is the GEOTA system that's out of Arizona State. It's actually free, which is nice.
I'd like to see, regardless of what the methods being employed may be, that when it relates to law enforcement agencies and law enforcement personnel, that they play a greater role in the analysis and review of the final product before it's published, particularly for applicability, as opposed to simply being the subjects of the research. I think there's a great wealth of research that sits on a shelf because practitioners don't play a role in the final stages in getting it to practice.
I don't have any strong preferences for methodology. I think all methods have advantages and disadvantages depending on the issue. I think all methods can be used well or badly. My daughter-in-law does a lot of fMRI research, and so I'll push her stuff because it's still fairly new. I'd love to see brain scans of everybody.
Okay. I would like to see natural experiments. I think of the kind, Al, that you're focusing on, but maybe ideally natural experiments of interventions that are more likely to affect a specific group and not affect other groups to assist in our ability to control for confounding factors. And I'll throw since I'm going last, I'll throw one more separate method in there, which is I'm intrigued. I continue to be intrigued by the sort of preventable death analysis, if it can be done in an objective way. If you can analyze the characteristics of a given event and apply a set of objective criteria to ask oneself, how could that event have been prevented?
I apologize, one more. I'd like to see an overall focus in research. It's been brought up a couple of times today and on this panel. Much more research on what we don't know, and that's our successes. We don't know about the things that succeed that don't make their way into death reports, how many things we actually do prevent, and how they get prevented. It goes on every day in I suspect, in great numbers. It doesn't make its way in. Yes, exactly. And much, much more. How many, the suicides that we prevent and the domestic violence that could make its way to a gun incident that doesn't occur. I really believe if we could learn more about the successes and build on those, truly many of the negatives would go away.
Without realizing, and I think you've just given a plug for David's book. So please.
I'll say one last thing too, which is that one nice thing would be if more government agencies and administrative agencies and would be willing to do randomized controlled trials instead of just here's an intervention, is that because often they could randomize and they don't. It would be great for researchers and for knowledge if we could get them to randomize.
Okay, then thank you very much today. I appreciate the panelists taking your time, traveling a distance, some of you greater than others, and for staying at the end of a very long day. And thank you for your contribution to the report and your participation today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Susan.
Yes.